attendees. I will We're gonna let people join for a few minutes, folks, while I deal with a tech issue that's coming up on the back end. Thank you for being here. I see people are starting to join as attendees, so thank you all for being here. Again, I'm just dealing with a tech issue, but we'll have it sorted soon. Oh. Appreciate you all being here. So we'll get started in just a couple of minutes once our audience is here.
I can hear you.
Thank you all for being here. All right. And thank you, panelists, for being here. I know that we're getting started in just a minute. As I deal with this tech issue, I really appreciate you all being here. All right. We have about 20 people RSVP'd to be here, so I'm going to give folks a minute to get here.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to test that out real quick.
All right. Just give it a second. Panelists, you should be able to turn your cameras on now. All right. We were having some tech issues. That's dealt with. We're going to jump in, even though it's not full, just in the interest of time, because we do have a big agenda, if that's all right with all of you. Thank you all for being here. We are recording this to go up on the JAWS website. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Cirien. I'm a board member with the Journalism and Women Symposium. I am a new board member. This is actually my first kind of public thing with JAWS. It still feels a little bit weird and new. Super glad that you can all be here. Today's webinar is part of our Beverly Wettenstein Women's History Month speaker series. And it's part of our work is this month is highlighting the work of women journalists and their efforts to build a more equitable journalism. The journalists that are joining us for today's panel represent many different forms of journalism: hyperlocal, photography, dual language, community journalism, journalistic research, and they're going to share the work that they've done, lessons learned, and where they think the work is going next. I'm going to actually ask folks to begin with introductions. If that'd be great, we're going to start brief. So if each one of you could go names, pronouns, naming the Indigenous land that you're on. I can put a link as well in the chat for anybody else who's interested in learning about that. And then just a few sentences on your professional or community journalism background. You all can just go, I'll call people, the teacher and me, we just want to be easy with the screen. Why don't we start with Marie, since you're first on my screen? So names, pronouns, the land you're on, and a few sentences on your background.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to join such a wonderful panel. My name is Marie de Jesús. I am currently now a photo editor for a new startup nonprofit newsroom called the Houston Landing. My pronouns are she, her, ella, and I am in Sana territory.
Thank you.
And yeah, and my background is, again, I was a photographer for the Houston Chronicle for 9 years. It was my third staff job, and a lot of the work I did was focus on immigration, special needs, education. That type of work was, the last 9 years have been focused on that.
Thank you for that. As an education reporter, I really appreciate that. Linda.
Hi, everyone. I'm Linda. My pronouns are she, her, and I I live on the former indigenous lands that belong to the Ojibwe and the Dakota peoples. And my background in community journalism, I became a journalist in small towns, putting out weekly newspapers in rural Wyoming. I worked for a Metro Daily, but I would say more pertinent to what we're discussing in topic today is I spent 12 years or so working in public radio at American Public Media, leading engagement and inclusion initiatives that spanned everything from diversifying sources and learning how to listen and do journalism with community, and also the workplace inclusion, DEI programs, and trying to make those workplaces more welcoming, belonging, and equitable. And my current work really involves working directly with BIPOC community media and helping them tap into community development funds, the trillions of dollars that are out there that companies have pledged to support Black and Brown communities, and then also the funds that are already sort of circulating within our communities that come from banks and that they're obligated to commit under the Community Reinvestment Act.
Thank you for that. Madeleine?
Hi, good morning. Happy to be here with you all. I'm Madeleine Bair, pronouns she, her. I'm on Ohlone land where I actually grew up here in Oakland and got my start in youth media. And since then, I've kind of straddled the fields of community media, traditional journalism, human rights documentation and advocacy, and a little documentary film. And I'm the founding director of El Tímpano, which serves Latino and Mayan immigrants in the Bay Area.
Thank you. Margaret? Miss Margaret?
Can y'all hear me? Okay, because I have this new microphone. I really don't know how to work it. So you all are like my guinea pigs today. But hello, everyone. I'm Margaret, Miss Margaret. I have she, her pronouns. I reside on Dakota land here in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm a radio personality, activist, educator, filmmaker, and mother. I started in radio I launched my radio show, Miss Margaret Live, in 2015. And since then it was WFNU, KFAI radio. I've worked with the Uptake. I also, as I mentioned, I'm an activist, organizer, and educator. So I work for an organization called Ed Allies, and I just launched their podcast called Amplify on all streaming platforms. Y'all go download that. And what else do I do? I do a whole lot, but I love everything in media. I love being able to combine media with what's going on out in the community and to specifically give folks a platform who otherwise normally wouldn't have a platform. So I'm really happy to be here with you all today. I probably skipped some other details, but want to keep it short. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Erika?
Thanks. Hi, I'm Erika Owens, she, her, on Lenni Lenape land in Philadelphia. I work with Open News, and we support the community of technologists in journalism, especially folks who are looking to push for change around equity and inclusion in their organizations. I was excited to hear the education thread, because that is where I got my start as well, working for a community publication in Philadelphia focused on the public schools. So yeah, excited to get to chat with everyone today.
I like it. We have a bunch of teachers in the room. And education people and people who use journalism as a tool to teach. That's my favorite kind. Thank you again for being here. Just a reminder, this is being recorded to go out to a larger audience. Super excited about that and to have everybody here. So, the overall question today is how do folks define equity in journalism, both as a practice and as a presence in news organizations and news reporting? Instead of just asking this one question, however, I'm going to be asking specific and individualized questions, just in the interest of time, but each person is welcome to jump in after sort of the point person answers. We're going to start with a question for Marie, and again, anybody else who'd like to jump in. You're a well-known photographer. Your name was recommended to me for this panel by several people. how do you use photography as a tool in equity work? And what kind of equity stories, quote unquote, even if not explicitly, have you tried to tell through photography? You mentioned, for example, special education, education reporting. How has photography been a tool for you in that type of work?
The way that I approach photography into topics that are sensitive has been a lot of it part of what comes innately to me, the way that I approach people, the way that I see different communities, but at the same time, the curiosity to understand things, not by the way that we have understood it in general, but the way that they have seen it. So my work in terms of like photography started being as authentic as I could in the spaces that I was entering. Later on, right, 16 years ago, I was not getting that type of training. So I was trying to like follow my heart. How will I, if there were national journalists entering into my parents' house in the middle of a hurricane in Puerto Rico, how would I want or expect a journalist to address them, talk to them, and present their stories? So you start with the basics, especially if you haven't had a long DEI history. Then I put that into practice and I started also pitching stories. And I would ask editors, let's stop, let's not publish yet, let's sit on this, let's invest time, let's get to know folks, let's do the research. And then you go creating a culture in the newsroom, in the photo department, on which if you want to enter into this type of topics and you want to work with Marie needs and wants and expects this type of treatment for this type of stories. Then I moved into more of the advocacy, right? Mentorship, advocacy, and then into photo editing, which is more of the management aspect of things. I am NPPA president, that's the National Press Photographers Association. And then how do you enter this topic into a space on which a lot of the conversations that are happening in those boardrooms are going to impact the industry wide? So then who do you put on those seats? Who are your advisors? Okay, so little by little, so it's more of a wholesome, right? It's bigger. It's not just empty calories. It's just a much more bigger view on this. Then now as a photo editor, I'm a new photo editor, right? So how do I approach that? What kind of conversations I am incentivizing in the reporters, and who am I hiring for those assignments for photographers, right? And that comes with sometimes a little bit of extra more work, right? Let's go into the communities. Let's see who are the photographers that no one knows about. There's a lot of talent in other neighborhoods. They might not have, that ivory education in academia in terms of like journalism, but they have a perspective and a background experience that will enrich the stories. So you see, it might have started as what kind of work I want to do. Do I want to sleep at night? Is this important for me, right? Do I want to be fair to people's stories? Then advocacy in terms of like, right, my volunteer work, mentorship, and then management. And in terms of like stories, I started with Denied, which was a year-long project on which we talked about how TEA, which is the Texas Education Department, had placed a cap on the amount of students that could receive special ed. It was an 8%, which is really low in comparison to the rest of the nation. Then obviously things related to immigration, because here we have a lot of newcomers here in Houston. I'm based in Houston. A big percentage of our residents are not born here. So that perspective, I needed to go deep into that. And then now I'm trying to explore pockets on which access to food is not up to standard, especially in a city like Houston, in which you expect that there is a lot of money. So education will always be very close to my heart, and I will always keep an eye on that. But I'm trying to touch into other sectors. Does that answer your question?
It was excellent. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And I feel like I have a lot to learn from you. Expect follow-up after this call, after this webinar. I'm going to move the question on to Margaret. And again, anybody who'd like to jump in after, just raise your hand or jump in as soon as the other person is done speaking. Margaret, you are an experienced community journalist with a background in radio and documentary filmmaking. You've used your platform to advocate for Black women entrepreneurs and other Black women journalists. In your mind, what is the role of equity in community journalism?
Yes, thank you. Some of the things that Marie, you were saying, I definitely resonate with. When I first started my radio show, the theme of the show was and has always been a seat at the table for those on the menu. Back in 2015, 2016, so many topics that aren't so taboo now were very taboo back then. And specifically here in Minnesota, it's very white male dominated when it comes to radio. So when I did my show, it wasn't a lot of people who look like me, having shows or giving people the space to have shows. So when I think of equity, I not only think of having a seat at the table, but do you even have a voice at that table? Because right now what I'm seeing is this trend of people saying, and I thought about, do I want to say this, but I'm just going to say this. I had a recent meeting, I've had a couple, and they're like, we want our station to advance, expand, evolve, which basically means we want Black folks in the room to make it look like this is where we're going. But what I have often found is you get in the room, but maybe you don't even have a voice in that room. Maybe, and I've experienced this even being in the boardroom at a station, of getting to what I thought was a high level and be excluded from meetings, being excluded from conversations. So for me, with my show, it's always been about not only providing that platform, it's about me providing a platform for the underdog. I don't even necessarily want to look like, a lot of times they'll say, okay, you have a topic, let's say it's mental health. The direction for a lot of folks would be to go find that popular, maybe mental health person, someone who already has a platform. I want that person who doesn't have a platform, because to me, when I think of equity, it's about giving that space. It's about having the voice when you are in the room. How does me even having you on my platform benefit you? Not just I have you on there, I'm looking for, views or whatever, but are you coming on my platform? Is that going to benefit you? What is that going to do for you? And for example, one year I specifically focused on Black entrepreneurship, but not just Black entrepreneurship, Black startup entrepreneurship. And so it was folks who were just starting, whether it was a nonprofit, whether it was a business, and who had a story to tell. Because with my show too, it's always been like, what was your story? How did you get there? For those folks who are listening, who might think they're never going to get there. So for me, that was also kind of my way of building equity, using journalism to build equity, for my community. And now, in a position, which I wish I could talk about, but I can't right now, of also building other forms of equity. And just lastly too, for my show, because specifically when I was on KFAI radio, I had a rotating team of engineers. A majority of that team were women. And I really wanted that because it's in radio, you don't see a lot of women in the room. And recently, radio personality Angela Yee, from the Breakfast Club and her new show, The Way Up, got so much flack for telling the truth. There aren't a lot of women in the actual room. You might see them in the offices outside of the studio, but they're not actually in the studio. They don't often actually get the opportunity. So that's where, I'm at right now, is just making sure that along this journey, I'm also creating opportunities, for other, but most importantly, no matter what, I'm not going to bring people in a situation where they already don't have a voice. That's the main thing that, we all have at the end of the day, whether it's through your photography, whether it's through radio, whatever it is, that's your voice, coming through. So that's how I think of equity, is not only being in the room, but are you valued in that room? And that's what I hope to provide with my show, documentaries, whatever it is that I do.
Thank you so much for that. Next question is for Madeleine and anybody who'd like to jump in. Madeleine, you run, I'm going to mispronounce this, Tímpano. Did I just get that right?
El Tímpano.
All right, El Tímpano. I'm gonna practice this. I
That's
promise.
fine.
Yeah, it's a renowned dual language community news organization. Given that experience, how have you tried to build equity and accessibility into your work? And what's your community's relationship with the news source?
Yeah. I mean, I would say equity is really at the heart of El Tímpano's mission. I want to be clear, I'm not a person of color. I'm not an immigrant. I'm not a Latina, but I grew up in a very diverse city, a very diverse community, and I've never seen that diversity reflected in the media. Not here in the Bay Area, not when I lived in Chicago or New York. And so El Tímpano's mission is to inform, engage, and amplify the voices of Latino and Mayan immigrants. When I moved back to the Bay Area about 6 years ago, I saw that Latino immigrants were the fastest growing communities here in Oakland, yet you would have no idea by consuming local media. And at the same time, there had really been a dwindling of any sort of Spanish language media that really serves their needs. And so, to me, equity, it's something that all journalists should care about. You don't have to be a person of color. Like, if you care about really the truths of our communities, of the diversity of stories that really reflect our communities, then you should really care that, that we're not hearing or we're not seeing all of that diversity, all of those stories really reflected in our media. And so it's been really important for me since, at the very beginning of starting El Tímpano to really listen to Latino immigrants in Oakland, one, because I'm not one myself, and two, because I feel strongly that no one is better equipped to tell their story than people themselves. And so we started really just by sitting down with, building relationships with Latino immigrants, with community leaders, primarily in East Oakland, to really hear from them. What are the issues that are important to you? What do you want to see in Spanish language media? What do you want to see changed in Spanish language media so it could better serve you, so it could better tell your stories, reflect your experiences, and help you, make decisions and take action. So that was really the starting point. And, El Tímpano, in terms of our relationship with the communities that we cover and serve, we're nothing without those relationships. Those relationships are really foundational to how we produce journalism. And the other way we really think of equity is also just in building the team. It's taken time. It's been a journey to grow an organization from the ground up. But we've been growing, primarily in the past 2 years, and we're now a team that I'm actually the only person who's not a first or second generation Latina immigrant. And my commitment to my team and our community is to build an organization whose staff and leadership really reflects the communities that we serve.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. All right, next question for Erika, and again, anybody who'd like to jump in. Erika, Open News is, as you well know, I'm biased about this, but Open News is an incredible journalism support organization. And again, in my very biased experience, how have you come to see equity play out in the conversations being had around you and the organization? And what role do you think organizations like Open News play in building journalistic equity?
Thanks. Yeah, definitely a lot of biased support of each other going on. Always excited for that. I mean, I think this has been a really interesting question for Open News over the years. So we're a little over 10 years old and began really focused on this community of technologists within journalism. So people doing data, people doing coding, design, work like that. And in about 2016, we did a survey just asking people about what they needed. And one of the questions was like, what is the number one thing that the journalism tech community needs? And so in a tech context, you could imagine like more money for this or more interest in that in terms of like technical tools or things like that. But the answer from the community that responded to the survey was more emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like that was the thing that was at the top of the community that we served list. And like, it's not actually a surprise if you get out of a kind of like technical bubble, because we've just heard from the other panelists as well, like the relationships that people have with each other are key, especially for technologists who often are in positions that are like outside of traditional silos in the newsroom. They're able to have a perspective and like see a lot more of what's going on, see what voices aren't heard in the development of a story, like see maybe who's getting laid off or not getting promoted equitably. And I think that like that really is part of what informed that answer, is being able to have that perspective outside of like one narrow silo in the news organization, and to name it as something that needs to change. And so like that response in that survey several years ago really helped kind of like reorient our work at Open News, still caring about technology, but also about seeing change around diversity, equity, and inclusion in news organizations. And I think what that means is, again, like we've heard, especially with the difference between a seat at the table and a voice at the table, is seeing actual change enacted. And like that, I'm expecting that will probably be something we'll get into in this conversation today, but like that still seems to be the major sticking point. We have an effort called the DEI Coalition, which is a Slack space for over 1,000 journalists who are also working on these issues together, founded by my colleague CC Wei. And that's a great space for people to share learning, share strategies, share tactics for making these change in their organizations. But still, we hear from a lot of people, it's like, yes, I'm so glad I can talk to people. When are we going to see the talking result in actual change? And I think yeah, that's where a lot of our attention is now. And especially lately seeing conversations around like these promises that were made in 2020 and like what has actually what, if anything, has actually happened, and maybe moving into like an accountability mode for some of those promises actually resulting in changes in news organizations. And I think one of the other things, especially for our community being a lot of people with technical skills, is there's a relative privilege in news organizations by having those skills. These roles are often more secure, better paid, and gives folks in our community maybe a little bit more room to agitate than journalists in roles that are maybe a little bit more precarious. And so that's also something that our community is thinking about, is kind of like how we wield our relative amounts of privilege within the field as well to push for that accountability.
Thank you for that. Linda, you recently wrote an essay for the Kettering Foundation on the need for a duty of care in journalism. What is a duty of care, and how would having one in journalism help to advance equity?
Well, thanks. I've been thinking about this idea of an ethic of care or duty of care, maybe just not naming it as such. And I will tell you right now that as I hear my fellow panelists talk, right now they are engaged they are applying ethics of care to their work, because you hear it shows up in things like solidarity and listening and reciprocity and empathy and, a concept of subsidiarity, right? Which is that if there are issues in a community, those who are best positioned to address, solve, and work on, and are already working on those issues, are the people who are closest to the issue, right? And so that is what you hear the journalism being done and advocated for by the women on this panel. And it's amazing. Personally, I think this idea of what does it mean, it's not so much how do we, let's make a definition of it and let's create a lot of structure around it. So let's just recognize where it's already happening. Let's lift that up and let's try to do more of that. But, professions like the medical profession, right? They have a duty of care, do no harm, right? And I would say, the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics, has something similar, which is minimize harm or, treat sources with respect or balance the public's right to know against, say, the harm or damage that might be caused. But in my experience, and I've worked, exclusively in white majority, white serving newsrooms. And so from that perspective, as a reporter or an editor, or even as a capacity builder, I think what I see is that even though journalists spend their entire careers engaged what I think is a never-ending care practice around information needs, so we're constantly identifying them, we're taking responsibility for helping to meet them, and we're kind of gauging the public response to our interventions, but we don't ever talk about what we're doing as a method of caring for our communities, right? Because in my experience, journalists, the sort of, I know, Cirien, you're a community trained journalist. I love this concept. I love this practice. I was trained as a journalist at a university, and then I mainly learned on the job. And what we're mainly taught to are care about issues or care about truth, seeking truth or holding the powerful to account. But to come out and explicitly say, I care about my community, and I care about the people in this community, and what does it mean if you start from that premise in journalism? And I say that, it shows up in a lot of ways. You've been hearing about it, today in practice. It starts with thinking about who informs your work. So this doesn't have to be journalism. It could be philanthropy. It could be, whatever you're doing to make decisions that are, affecting communities and people. It's who's informing that work, right? So that, for me, in my experience, that's sources. Who in the community do you turn to? Whose perspectives, expertise are you amplifying and lifting up? And who's, and just as important, whose perspectives are you marginalizing or you're just completely ignoring? And too often, we sort of have especially women, people of color in our community, are treated as people who are affected by things and not with people who have the power to affect change. So that's another way to think about that. So who informs the work? Who forms the work, right? So who's actually, who's in the newsroom? What is the makeup? What is the diversity? How are they allowed to use their lived experience to inform what they do or what they care about? And, in my experience, and I, don't think at all I'm alone in having observed this, even if I haven't personally experienced it myself, but journalists of color and women, well, I suppose I have experienced it, as a woman, but I'm not a woman of color. If you show care toward a community, if you want to cover an issue or delve into an issue that affects your community, too often, especially people of color in our newsrooms, are told, you're not objective, or you are too close to this issue. And in many cases, this idea that you're not allowed to care for the communities you report on, somehow you're not going to be able to do your job and separate, this idea of information that may be hard to hear or hard to learn. So I think that is really important that, we have representation, but as Margaret pointed out, that's not enough. If you're not in positions of decision-making, of power, of changing systems, of being able to reorient practices, then it really is tokenism. And I would say the third area that I think really shapes, if you were thinking about how do we do a practice of care, it's who benefits from our work, right? And that is a question that when I was a working reporter or editor, hardly ever was asked or discussed. Not only it wasn't asked who's benefiting from this, but who's harmed by it. And then, so when you talk about things like we have an ethic that says balance of public's right to know against the harm that can be caused, you have to actually identify that harm, and you have to be aware of it, and you have to be taking actions to, alleviate that harm. So that's a general sense of, of how that shows up. I mean, I'm really proud to be talking about this in this group and in a JAWS sponsored seminar, because so much of the thinking about a duty of care and ethics of care has come through feminist scholarship, right? And so you think about Carol Gilligan, and here in the Twin Cities, Joan Tronto has done a lot of work around ethics of care in democracy. And, it's just that I'll just end by saying, like, if we can all agree that information needs are care needs, right? Because we are caring for our community, providing them with relevant, action-oriented, information that reflects their experience, their views, what they want to see in their community, then journalism is the practice of meeting those needs. And, a big part of that is correcting the power imbalance that we have. And so if in terms of how this can affect equity, I just think if we do what the journalists on this panel are doing, right, and being allowed to openly care about our communities and say what that looks like, I think that can inevitably lead to a more equitable, inclusive, and responsive, ecosystem.
Thank you for that. And thank you, all of you. That was wonderful. Linda, if you could send us a link to the Kettering Foundation article that you wrote, that would be really, really great.
I will. It hasn't been published yet. It's actually it's an essay that's part of a series called Reinventing Journalism, and it has some amazing essayists that are part of it. But I'm happy to put a link in the chat and let you know. And also, I can, if anybody's interested in receiving like a review copy, I can, arrange that too.
Awesome. Let's chat after. I appreciate it. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I'd love to see that. And I wanted to jump in because, I think I'm just loving these conversations around the duty of care as we can apply it as journalists and with our own newsrooms. My colleague Maya Primera actually facilitated a session at the last Open News convening about how we can better take care of ourselves as journalists by taking better care of our audiences. And, her kind of bringing up that session and framing it in that way made me realize something that I hadn't really connected the dots before. But, when El Tímpano started by just listening to community members, we heard so much. I mean, I think probably the most common feedback that we heard from community members was that they were avoiding news because it was filling them with anxiety and panic and not giving them information that they could actually use to be engaged, to take action. And so they were telling us that it's harming us, the news as it's produced. And then at the same time, I hear so much from colleagues who have been and friends who have burned out of journalism. And those two issues are very related. Thinking more about what is the impact of our journalism? What is the impact that we want to make? I just love how you posed these questions, Linda, and I'd love to see that article. And I think there's such great work being done in individual newsrooms among individual journalists. But back to Margaret's point is I think like some of the resources to support that sort of work is slow to really catching up with this. And I think part of it is this kind of long-standing theory of change really around journalism, and journalism being focused more on, exposing abuse or shining a spotlight on something and bringing it to, a massive audience or audiences that can make change, rather than that theory of change really being on how do we serve our communities. And I think that's what we really need to transform, is like that thinking of, what is our theory of change of journalism? Because that drives so much of the sort of, impact for positive or negative that we're seeing and that we're talking about.
Oh, I'm super excited about this, by the way. I have some thoughts between all of you brought up some really powerful things around. I can see there's a hand up. It just gave me a popped up hand. Am I seeing somebody or missing somebody? All right. Assuming that or from the attendees, let me see. Roberta, I'm going to allow you to talk according to the machine. So I don't know if I like this webinar structure. It doesn't give us the freedom we need.
Thank you.
Roberta.
Can you hear me?
Yes. I'm
inspired by this conversation and really look forward to reading Linda Miller's article. It resonates deeply. I was an investigative reporter for more than 30 years with ABC and CBS and PBS, now with Bill Moyers. And my goal was always exposing abuses, mostly corporate misconduct stories all over the world, and corruption, which was always low-hanging fruit. And I really had a transformation through a group I was involved with for 20 years called Images and Voices of Hope, where we were in inquiry, really thinking about these issues, about who are we as journalists and what's the impact that we want to have. And I don't regret the work that I did in terms of always, really, my husband used to say that I could end my stories with, for CBS News, I'm Roberta Baskin, and then you die, because so many of my stories were just, would make you feel terrified or miserable. And I realized that there is this hunger for what are the solutions, where's the resilience in the community, what is our role as journalists? And in this inquiry that we had, where we had summits for 20 years, we came around after the Newtown shooting, where the community was left with such despair. All of those live trucks left and the journalists left, and the editor of the Newtown Bee wrote about it in the New Yorker, about the despair that, the community being identified as this place where this horrible incident happened. And so we created something called restorative narratives. And restorative narratives are really thinking about how do you tell a deeper story, not the black and white stories that we usually do as journalists, but how can we think about strength-based storytelling and going deeper in the questions that we ask and spending more time really with the subjects that we're interviewing, and coming with a very open mind and listening deeply. And so Images and Voices of Hope went away. It's combined forces with another group called the Peace Studio, and I'm on the board of that. And we're working on creating a syllabus about restorative narratives and what that means. And we also have journalism fellows who we give $10,000 to work on a project that is a restorative narrative. And I just wanted to share that with you because I have done a 180 in my own thinking about journalism, in that nothing wrong with those investigative stories exposing abuse and wrongdoing, but that we need to have more that supports communities and speaks to their needs and to solutions. And one last thing is I started something called Aim to Flourish, which was a platform where instead of looking at companies doing wrongdoing, I looked at who's doing it right in the world and worked with business school students around the world, teaching them about the Sustainable Development Goals and asking them to go out and interview a business leader, a CEO, an innovator who is in some way helping to achieve one of the SDGs. And there's now more than 3,500 stories on the website written by business school students who did these deep interviews with leaders. And it's in more than 100 countries, these students. So it's been I'm a slow learner, I think. It's taken me, I was a journalist for more than 30 years. But in my old age, I'm really enjoying thinking, listening to what you're talking about just makes my heart open. I'm excited about, everything that you're contributing and this space of more strength-based storytelling. Thank you.
Thank you. This is such a wonderful conversation. I was educated by women religious for all the way through undergrad, and they used to say the people who are here are the people who are supposed to be here, and it just feels really pertinent. And I know for Margaret and I are reporters in Minneapolis, St. Paul. We have a really interesting experience in this post 2020 world and post the uprising and the riots that I think we have a really shared experience of community journalism that tells us that this shows us both the power, the work of Georgia Fort, the work of so many to bring truth to bear, but also the brokenness that's kind of inherent in the field. And we're kind of living that in a really powerful way. And Linda is here in St. Paul as well. So we have this connection to something that changes. It's forever changed how I think about journalism and our responsibility towards community, but it's also made it more real, if that makes sense.
Some of the work that I do now really through the Multicultural Media and Correspondence Association, right? So we're looking at the connections between creating a more equitable economy and what is the role of how could our efforts to do that lead to greater investments in equitable journalism. And so, if we're needing a definition, we're talking about journalism that is that prioritizes the information needs of the very communities who are being currently most harmed by, the sort of white-owned, white-serving media ecosystem that we have. And, you think about this, whether it's, you think about it as, an ethic of care, but it's all the ways that we want to help our communities to thrive. There should be accessible, affordable housing. There should be, healthy food, and there should be jobs, there should be, services and all of these things. But we rarely talk about, a news media ecosystem as being part of that civic infrastructure. And yet we all are part of building that infrastructure, right? It exists. And, there's a great example, I think, in the Twin Cities with Pillsbury United Communities, right? Which is a social enterprise organization that owns media properties, right? So they didn't find the journalism existing for the communities that they serve with all their other programs. So they said, well, we're going to create that media. And so when you think about journalism as a social enterprise, where you're using it to build capital, and you can wall that off. I think way too much energy is spent on things like, a firewall and objectivity and all of that, because I think journalists in their heart know, right? They're trained to hold powerful people to account, yet there's so little tolerance for that within a lot of newsrooms, right? To have journalists hold their own organizations to account. And I think what you see represented here are organizations that from the very foundation are doing that. They're holding themselves accountable to the community, right? That's where the primary accountability. It's not just about holding people in positions of power. They're recognizing the power that media has in a community and creating some accountability around that. And it's really exciting to see.
Thank you. Marie, you had mentioned earlier, it's something that strikes me based on what Linda and others are sharing related to how would you feel if a photographer walked into your parents' house? And when we treat our communities with that depth of love and respect and honor, and we treat our communities as if they're part of a a team, a conversation, something that brings, same with Madeleine in your work in Oakland, when you treat your community as if they're part of the work and part of the team, and we each have a responsibility to that, not just to the journalism, but to the community as a whole, that the love and that duty of care that comes to the table when we do that is different than as if we act like journalists who are going into a community, maybe with respect for it, but not as part of a collaboration, where our audience is as much a part of the process as we are, as the journalists. And I'm wondering, for all of you, what does love have to do with it? Love for community, love for the work that we do? Because I got to tell you, being a journalist is amazing in these last 10 minutes, but it's also really tough. And how do you remember to love the community that you're doing this work in?
Okay, I just want to jump in. So, because being, like you said, Cirien, being a journalist, particularly here in Minneapolis, St. Paul, I'm like, where do you even start with this? There's so much that, okay, let me just go back to when George Floyd was murdered, right? When George Floyd was murdered, us in activism, everyone, the Linda, because you're up here, we've never stopped. We have a huge, very powerful activist community. We've been shutting down freeways and all that before, George Floyd was killed. When George Floyd was killed, I feel like we all just jumped in head first, and particularly from like the journalism world. You had a lot of people who jumped into journalism, a lot of streamers and stuff like that. But we didn't really know how to take care of ourselves through that. And for me, particularly, I remember the first week of the uprisings, those, who were here know how crazy that was, and how particularly there was a point when we had a lot of dumpsters being set on fire. We had a lot of people coming from all these other states and basically harassing Black and brown neighborhoods. And of course, we couldn't call the police because all the police were in Minneapolis, where everything was going on, and we had to become our own reporters. I was staying up. I mean, I probably got
4 or 5 in the morning every night waiting for the fires to end.
So, because you were following me. So we were up all day long, and then particularly we're reporting from like maybe 10 o'clock, 8 o'clock at night, all the way until maybe 2, 3 a.m. in the morning, just watching police scan or watching anything that we could find to report out in the community. Hey, here's what's happening. We saw this sighting, this place and that place. My one friend was working at the airport, TSA at the time. So she was breaking down the police codes for us so we could understand what they were saying on the scanner, so we could tell people, hey, they just had this sighting of this suspicious activity, these suspicious white folks. I was sending out money to people, donations that were coming in from all around the country. I was sending out money in the middle of the night for people who were like, I'm too scared to stay in my house. Okay, here's some funds. You can go get a hotel room for the night. So what's love got to do with that situation alone is everything. Like, I'm a mother too. I have an 8-year-old son. So here I am in my little home control center doing all this and having to tend to him as well, because of the love for the community, but also because I felt like we had no choice but to help ourselves. And so one thing I've learned through this though is that you cannot always sacrifice your love for yourself, or take care of yourself for the community. If you're like, my community tells me all the time, like, Margaret, we need you to take care of yourself, because if you don't take care of yourself, we won't have you. We won't even have someone who could be that voice, who could have that platform, So for me, it goes hand in hand. But with this type of work, no one's doing it just for fun or for blank and giggles. You know what I mean? I don't know what type of panel this is, if I could say the real word, but for blank and giggles. No one's doing that. They're solely doing it because of the love, and they feel like it's their purpose. And if they're not doing it, they're not fulfilling their purpose. Now, I ain't trying to talk for all the panelists, but I'm just going to guess, because of what we do in the realm that we're in, if love wasn't at the center, we would be like, I'm gonna go do something. Let me just get this standard little check and call it a day so I can take my vacations and live my life. So love has everything to do with it. And I got what's love got to do with it stuck in my head. I'm probably going to go play that later, but I just had to chime in on that real quick.
I love that. I just have to say, there's a line in a movie. I think the movie is Fever Pitch, and it's about, I don't know, has Drew Barrymore and Jimmy Fallon, and he's in love with the Red Sox. And there's a moment where one of his, Little League baseball players says, coach, you love the Red Sox, but have they ever loved you back? And I think about our newsrooms that way, right? Like, we love our communities. If we want our communities to love us, support us, like sustain us as critical parts of our civic infrastructure, right? We have to demonstrate that love and that care to them every day. And they know, and they know if they feel cared for by the work you do. Right. But we also need that care within our organizations. Right. I mean, and I think that's why the work that Open News does and the conversations that they lead around, and it isn't even around self-care. I really actually hate that word. It's like, it's on you to care for yourself. No one else has any responsibility. Right. Because that our organizations have responsibility to care for the people who are out doing the work.
Thank you. So we have just like 5 minutes. Wow, this has gone incredibly fast. Is there any questions from attendees for the panelists, or panelists for each other even, in just these last few minutes? If not, I have legitimately a list of so many questions here, but I'd much rather hear from all of you.
I wanted to just point out real quick, I don't remember what you just said, but I just wanted to point out something Linda said earlier. I'm trying to make it quick. But one of the things that you talked about is how a lot of times, even when you get in the newsroom and you report a story that's from your community, it's labeled as you're being objective. And I recently had a meeting with one of the top public radio stations in Minnesota. And you could take that as, and it was a group of pretty much majority women, Black journalists, and journalists who focus on the activism community world. And the president of said station said it was a way to kind of shut us down. The whole point was kind of what we're doing here. How do we build equity at this station? And we're giving all these ideas, and he wasn't really feeling them. And he says, well, I would never hire an activist in the newsroom. And you're sitting here with all these journalists who are activists, but you're asking us. You came to us to ask what to have in your newsroom. Then we told you, you said, no, I don't want to do that. But then you're sitting here you're profiting though off the guys that you are doing that, because people know you're having this meeting. Y'all see where I'm going with this? So I just want to point out, because a lot of times people will say, well, why aren't you on this station? Or why aren't you on this? It's because half the time when we get there, they get us there for the look of it and then tell us that we can't, report our own stories. They tell you all these things to get you in the room, and you're there and it's, oh, well, no, we're going to wait on that. We're going to, maybe some other time, or it's the time factor. We need a lot of time to tell our stories. They deserve that time, and it's not given to us. So I just wanted to touch on what you were saying, because it's so true. And I've experienced it. I've experienced we want you to come to our station. We know you're an activist. We want that type of content. Then I get there and, this seems like a conflict of interest. Well, aren't those folks known as disruptors? And I thought you wanted that though to evolve your station. I thought you wanted those type of guests. I thought you wanted that type of conversation. So I just had to point that out, because I've experienced that. And if there's people who are listening to this and they wonder why you don't see a lot of Black journalists or journalists of color, period, specifically in Minnesota newsrooms, that's why. Because even if we get there, they tell us we can't be ourselves. And then you got to make a choice. Am I going to go into this kind of realm? I'm choosing my words. I was going to say something else. Or am I going to try to, do something on my own so no one can take my mic away from me ever again? So some of this get me triggered and I start going. But I know I'm in a safe space with y'all. So
It's all good.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, I was at that same meeting. It was interesting. There's nothing quite like being told, I don't know, your newsroom isn't valid because you talk directly to community members, or your PhD doesn't mean anything to us because we don't care about actually educating community members around journalism. Like, I left that meeting early, real fast. I was like, no, I'm done.
You see, I said my piece that I said after he said I would never hire an activist in the newsroom. And I was like, I just got done reporting the news, but okay. And I said what I had to say, and I left. I wish y'all could have all been in that meeting so you could really hear, but it was just crazy. All right, here we are in this meeting. They're coming to us. How do we build equity? But not what you're talking about. We don't want to do it that way. We just want to tell people we had y'all at this meeting.
I know. And look, just quickly, I will say two things. That when I worked, I think at the same radio station, right, I was tasked with coming up with a definition for relevance that could be measurable. And we went and listened to communities that currently don't find this organization relevant in their lives. And the way they defined relevance is it's solidarity and reciprocity. It's like, we need to know that your future is tied up with our future, and we want to feel like that. But when we ask the people who actually work in this organization how they define relevance, it's completely different. It's something that expands my perspectives, or opens my, and it's like, no, it comes down to like, are we in this together? And I think that disconnect, right, between how people have been trained and socialized into the field of professional journalism, and that care element has been completely, extracted. And then you want to know why you're not relevant. It's because you're not even talking the same language.
Mhm. Thank you for that. Last question for each of you, 30 seconds each in the interest of time. Any last thoughts, any last things about equity or how we care for our communities as journalists that you want to share with us, or resources you want to point us to? And why don't we start with Madeleine, and then we'll go in reverse.
I mean, I'm just loving being in conversation with you all, and I think we need to continue having these conversations, and like, we are creating the sort of journalism that we want to see, and I'm inspired by you all, and by the communities that El Tímpano serves, and so I'm just grateful for this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. I'm going on my screen.
Oh yeah, no problem. I gotta echo. There's so many. This has been highly educational for me too. So I am so glad that I spent lunch with you all. I want to say that my concern is often that it stays in this type of bubble. How do we, everything that I will say, it will resonate with you all, because this is like, this is the substance in your life, in your career. This is what motivates you. But how the ones that need to hear it in the back, that is the majority of right now my concern. How do we send this message to this other people?
Thank you for that. Linda?
Well, I just want to applaud the women on this panel, because you're doing the work, right? I work in a capacity building role. And if I would say how can we get this outside of the bubble and make this a more normative practice, then I would say we have to double down and get funding for what you're doing. And, I spent decades, and I do not think it was wasted effort, trying to reform newsrooms and trying to help make them more equitable. And we need that. But we need to be spending as much or more resources supporting the organizations that are already doing it and the people already doing it. And that is, to me, where we get the balance, right? Yes, we need more reform, more diversity in our mainstream newsrooms. And that is a worthy cause and fight. But less than 8% of philanthropic dollars that go to journalism go to BIPOC community journalism outlets. Like, we have to rectify that. And we have to tap into the funds that are already out there and available to do good work in the community. And we just have to apply them to journalism.
Thank you. Erika, sorry, I'm starting to lose track of my names. It's been a long day.
Sure. Yeah, I'll go ahead. Thanks. I've also really appreciated this conversation. The thing I'm really thinking about is power, and especially the frame that Linda mentioned a little bit earlier about, like, it's always like, oh, we have to like get some power from those people over there, but like, we have a lot of power ourselves, and like, there are definitely a lot of these like speaking to the choir kind of moments, like you mentioned, Marie, but I think there's more of us than we think. And like, what can we do collectively with the power we have in the positions we're in, and use that instead of always just trying to like convince someone else. And since that is such a dominant way of thinking about things that I catch myself like really training myself on all the time, like just how do we break through that and like wield the collective power that we do have together?
Thank you. And Margaret.
Well, first and foremost, follow me on all social media platforms because they might ban TikTok and I'm stressed about it. I got TikTok live and going on my background like, yeah, these might be the final days. But so follow me at least on Instagram. I guess I'm gonna have to start Instagramming now. Yeah, it's just been really great to be here with y'all. It's always great, particularly to be with women, in journalism, because we just have a whole set of other things that we have to deal with, no matter what form you're in. And so I hope that we continue to do, stuff like this, and we all keep in contact, but I'm really glad to be here with you all. And so just, follow me. Got some stuff coming up.
Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. There's lots of resources that were talked about today. I'm going to gather them and share them out with everybody who was signed up as a panelist. Thank you to all the panelists for being here. I have great love and respect for each one of you. I'm excited to hopefully do virtual coffee to follow up with these, and we will be in touch. And I'll make sure the recording gets out. Thank you all.
Thank you, Cirien.
Thank you all.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.